I made a point of doing it with the greatest amount of respect. I didn't malign or condemn the four host First Nations. I talked about the values of the Olympic versus the injustices toward Indigenous people. And I seem to have done all right because there wasn't any nasty backlash. I think the four host First Nations appreciated the fact that I was respectful, yet direct and honest. So I came up as a band counselor. I was a counselor for 10 years, sitting at the council table and learning firsthand a lot of the issues that confront our communities. And eventually I began to eyeball the big chair and ran for chief and was successful and was chief for 14 years, which is quite a long time. When you consider premiers come and go in 2 and 3 years, or 3 years, and you know, one's about to go pretty soon. Thank God for that. I've served as the chair of the Okanagan Nation Tribal Council for quite some time, and spokesman, and again I'm the chair of the Okanagan Nation Tribal Council. And I'm in my 12th year as the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And I've seen a lot during my time in those various leadership capacities. I've seen a lot of change, and yet at the same time I've seen too many things stay the same. And in terms of the poverty in our communities, it's deepening, it's worsening by virtue of the fact that our populations are growing at several times the national average. Our demographics are increasingly getting to the point where well over 50, 60, 70% of our people are below the ages of 25. And when we have public events, particularly what really brings this home is when a young person commits suicide. And unfortunately that happens far too often in many parts of the country, and certainly the province of British Columbia. Suicides are epidemic, youth suicides. And when you go to those funerals, there's just a crush of young people. And it's really something to witness. So governments haven't changed. We're getting to a point here where this year represents the 100th-year anniversary of some memorials that were signed off in the interior with Sir Wilfrid Laurier. And there's going to be a celebration of sorts at Spence's Bridge later this summer to look back on the last 100 years and to look what was within that particular memorial document. There was another document signed in Kamloops in August 100 years ago with Frank Oliver. And these are foundational documents for us. They represent the voice of our ancestors and the hopes and aspirations at that time of how we would share the land and how we would share resources and how we would respect each other's way of life and not encroach upon each other's interests. And we know that went out the window pretty fast.
So they lied back then too.
Well, nothing has changed. I mean, that's the whole point of having the celebrations and the looking back, because what our ancestors laid out in terms of principles are certainly reflected in a lot of the modern day declarations that have come forward from our communities. Yet the intransigence of the Government of Canada and certainly the Province of British Columbia hasn't changed. Canada is more you know, is more upfront about its racist and adversarial approach to the Indigenous issues in this country. The Harper government makes no bones about his, you know, his vehement opposition to Indigenous rights, to Indigenous land rights, Indigenous human rights. And that was ably demonstrated when Canada was one of the very few countries that not only refused to endorse the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but campaigned vigorously before the UN went to a vote to attempt to ensure that it never did, was never supported by the majority of countries. And needless to say, they failed in that effort. As it stands, Australia was one of the 4 countries that opposed the declaration, and they've since reversed their position. New Zealand is at the point of changing their position. And the Union of BC Indian Chiefs has been in the press in New Zealand chastising the New Zealand government because they've taken the same approach as the government of Canada. After a great deal of pressure, Canada is really offering a backhanded notion of supporting the declaration, insofar as they're saying, yeah, we're prepared to support the declaration as long as it conforms to the Constitution and to all of our racist policies and legislation and whatnot, which is really no support at all. Our view is international instruments and covenants are international for a reason, and they have to be respected, and no government has a right to attempt to domesticate those international declarations. It defeats the purpose of having them and whatnot. And we hear the U.S. is also looking at changing their view and their position on the declaration. But it really doesn't mean a lot here in Canada because on the land rights side, Canada is still clinging to the 1986 Comprehensive Claims Policy, which underpins all land claims, so-called land claims negotiations. And the Comprehensive Claims Policy of '96 absolutely does not recognize Aboriginal title. And the essence of that policy is the statements is something along the lines, Aboriginal Canadians may have some generally and loosely defined rights to lands and resources. The Government of Canada is prepared to exchange those general and vaguely defined rights for specific rights within a land claims agreement. So that's the reason that the BC treaty process that has been in place now for 17 years has not really produced any results, any appreciable results. The Tawasin Agreement is somewhat of an anomaly because Tawasin was one of those few communities that doesn't have a sweeping breadth of territory and lands and resources, and, you know, forestry and minerals and fish and so on. They were pretty much hemmed in by a number of municipal jurisdictions, and they approached the negotiations as an economic issue and felt that this was a one-time opportunity to be able to leapfrog over the environmental constraints of increasing the superport. And it was a backroom deal, and it was shoddy, and you know, it's unfortunate, but they have, you know, we recognize they have a right. You know, the right of self-determination is you have the right to determine